and welcome to Path to Purchasing for Garden Center consumers, hosted by the Floral Marketing Fund. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit of background on the fund. The Floral Marketing Fund's mission is to develop, support, and promote collaborative fundraising, research, and marketing efforts to increase flower sales. You can learn more and get involved with future efforts by visiting floralmarketingfund.org, which you will also see in the chat. While there, you can view our 15 available research reports and other marketing resources. Today, we'd also like to thank all of the additional program sponsors who made this study possible and extend a huge thank you to the researchers at the Vineland Research and Innovation Center and the University of Guelph who led the study. Our presenter today is researcher Dr. Amy Bowen. Amy is the Director of Consumer Insights at the Vineland Research Center with 12 years of experience in research and innovation. She leads a team of researchers who understand the drivers that impact preference and choice to create value-added products for the horticulture sector. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to Amy to present the findings and answer your questions. Any questions that we do not get to within the hour can be submitted to info@floralmarketingfund.org for an email response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. As she mentioned, my name is Amy Bowen, and I'm from the Vineland Research Innovation Center. And I'm very excited to be here today to be able to share the results of this two-year study that we did working in collaboration with the University of Guelph. So let me just get my slides sorted here and moving forward. First of all, sort of Karen mentioned it in the introduction, but this research would not have been possible without a lot of different sponsors. And so I just want to put them up front and center to acknowledge their support, both in terms of, advice, guidance, funding to make this project possible. So obviously the Floral Marketing Fund, collaborators at the University of Guelph, Canadian Nursery Landscape Association, as well as Landscape Ontario, and then also Vineland, for supporting this work as well. So Karen talked about the Floral Marketing Fund, but we just have that in here in case anybody is interested in the slides. They can be made available. So we have all the information in here. And the other thing I wanted to mention just before getting into it is the research team, because it was quite extensive. And I think part of what made the project so valuable in terms of the insights that were identified. So first of all, from Vineland itself, Alexander Gorchak, who sort of spearheaded and started leading this project, and then went on parental leave. So then Mithun and I sort of took the reins over on it in her leave. And then Sasha Miller, who helped us with the intercept interviews at garden centers. And then as well, the collaborators at the University of Guelph. So Joanne Wang, who unfortunately couldn't co-present with me today, but she was very instrumental in the design and especially the online survey results that we'll be sharing with you today, along with her graduate student, Nicole Wang. And then as well, throughout this, we wanted to make sure that everything that we found and presented and that we worked on, that it was going to be relevant to the industry. And so we worked with Anne Cadwell from the Canadian Nursery Landscape Association, who helped connect us with the industry to ensure that the plants we were working on, the results, the questions we were asking would be of relevance to the industry. So I hope you find that to be true today. So getting into what it was that we were trying to do. So essentially, we were trying to connect the dots of effective decision-making, of trying to understand what consumers value when they go in to purchase plants. So, is it the price? Is it the features? What are those sort of specific qualities? And so to do this, we went through a three-step approach. So first, we wanted to do sort of a preliminary study to kind of get some information, figure out what our research questions were going to be, and figure out what we should be focusing on based on feedback from consumers. So we did some preliminary interviews at garden centers, and then we used that information, what we gathered from that, and we did an online survey of Canadian and US consumers this past summer to get them to sort of basically create like a shopping experience to see how they interacted with those plants, and then followed up by a short qualitative study to look at how consumers view basically online versus in-person shopping at garden centers, since that's been sort of a shift in consumer behavior over the course of this study the past couple of years. And then I've got some summary and recommendations that I'll share with you as well today. So first, to go through this preliminary study. So we completed this in the fall of 2020. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to capture the path to purchase for garden center shoppers. So we wanted to understand the role of pricing in nursery plant decision making. And we want to understand what were the qualities of both the plant and the garden center that influenced what plants consumers purchased. Tongue twister there. So in terms of our methods for this, we had, this was just focused on Canadian consumers. We had 44 shopper intercept interviews that were completed. So 3 at garden centers located in Southern Ontario, because that's in close proximity to Vineland. We're hosting it, so the kind of Greater Toronto area. And then we also have 1 garden center in British Columbia and 1 in Saskatchewan. Shoppers were intercepted at the cash register and were invited to participate. So these were people that had already made a decision to purchase a plant that we were asking these questions to. So what did we find? So essentially, we saw this sort of 4-step process that went into, making a decision to purchase a plant. So the first thing was kind of the planning. So they, thought about, I need to get a new plant, and thought about where they want to put it, what it should look like, what its sort of size was. They might do some preliminary scoping to sort of get some ideas of what types of plants they would want. And then they would go into a retail location. And go into the retail location, and ask why they would choose a garden center. It'd be for the desire of sort of high quality and sort of selection of plants that were available, and also to be able to talk to the store staff. Then they would, go and start browsing. They would look at the different plants. They would talk to the staff. They would then select something based on its dimensions, its colors, how healthy it looked, and in terms of going through it and making that. And then they would take that plant, and then they would go and make a purchase. And so 2 things we've found within this kind of path to purchase was, one is that price seemed to be a bit of an afterthought, which I'll talk about later, and that there was very little impulse purchasing, which I'll also mention in follow-up slides. So what did we ask them? What were we trying to kind of find out? So first of all, we asked, when you want to purchase a garden plant, do you normally go to a garden center to purchase it? And so what we found is that, garden center clientele are not your average Canadian plant purchasers. So when we compared the results of this intercept to other studies we had done about sort of looking at the average Canadian plant purchaser, we found that, people that go into garden centers are sort of true like hobbyists, are people that are looking for specialized plants, are sort of, lovers of plants, and are looking for sort of a different shopping experience. So we found that if they shop at 64% of them shop at garden centers exclusively, versus an average plant purchaser, which would be about 31%. In contrast, these garden center shoppers were much less likely to shop both at garden centers and at like a grocery hardware store, at being about only 27% versus 60% as being the average. And they also purchase more plants. So 50% of them saying that they would purchase 10 plus plants like in a year. So the consumers that are coming into the garden centers are really sort of focused and, are your target market, right? They're your target consumers that are coming in. So we asked them, before you arrive, do you already know specifically which plant you want to purchase? And what we found here was that about 60% had a general target in mind. But, so most didn't know what they wanted. They just had a sense of what it was. So, some people were looking at species only. Some people were looking at, maybe the size, the hardiness. They were looking for a specific color or, dimension that they were looking at. But very few people were coming in looking for something very specific, that they wanted this species and this color and this size. So that was something of interest, that their minds aren't made up about what they're going to purchase until they arrive at that garden center. So then, since we knew the decisions were being made at the garden center, said after arriving, how do you go about selecting which plant to buy? And so we found that, dimensions was a big thing, and that makes sense when we think of that plant path to purchase, and that they're thinking of, where's this plant going to fit? Where's this going to go in my garden, in my garden landscape? Followed by sort of the dimensions of it was the aesthetics at 32%, with color being the predominant thing. So making sure it had the right color that they desired. followed up by vitality, meaning, did the plant look healthy? Did it look like it was going to, thrive, when transplanted at their home? And performance features were much lower on the decision-making list, and price was at the bottom. So that was something we found to be very interesting, was price being at the bottom. We also found that 41% of the shoppers consulted staff prior to making their final purchase decision, again, showing you the value of the retail staff in the garden centers. So price assessment. So we asked them, did you notice the price before making a purchase decision? And what we found was that 68% price didn't factor into their decision making, which seems, crazy when we think of, price being such a sort of key thing in what we would expect consumers to be valuing when purchasing plants. But what we found was that most people just sort of stated that they either didn't notice the price or they noticed the price and that they felt it was fair, and that, they, that's the plant they wanted. So that's the plant that they wanted to sort of, wanted to be purchasing. Of the ones that did make a price comparison, it was only about 30% of the consumers, and it typically didn't influence their decision of whether or not they were going to purchase it. So we thought this was, really interesting information, that the majority of consumers were using price as an afterthought. And so that means that there's other features that are in those plants that they're valuing more in terms of making these decisions. And impulse purchasing. So only 16% of shoppers made an impulse purchase. So, we work on a lot of different horticultural products. And so this number surprised us because, if you think of it, approximately 80% of grocery shoppers make an impulse purchase. So 16% seemed very low. So what we sort of thought is this because they've come in, if you think of that path to purchase again, they've come in with a decision already made of what they're going to buy. So they're coming in to buy this plant. So they buy this plant and then they walk out, versus sort of coming in for, sort of a shopping experience. And so, perhaps if they don't have a spot to put the plant, then, they're not going to be purchasing it. So what were our key takeaways from this? Well, one, as I mentioned, is that price was not a major focus. And so what this does is it gives some flexibility in pricing when you're thinking about how to, sort of set up the structure, within your store. And we thought this is something we need to focus on a little bit more in the next phase of the research is, okay, if price isn't, a major factor, then what are the features that they do value more and that they may pay a premium for? And also that their purchase objective wasn't planned out. And so a lot of these decisions are made in store. And so the role of the store itself in guiding consumers in terms of what they're valuing in the plants and what there then is choice to purchase. And then, as I mentioned, that impulse purchasing is low, especially for plants. So what we did is we sort of took all of this information and thought about, well, how do we want to use this moving forward to answer more questions? And in terms of answering more questions, we wanted to understand, okay, so, within these plants, if they're not looking at the price tag, what are they looking at to make their decisions to purchase? And then are there ways that we can look at sort of price sensitivity of these plants? So then what we did was we wanted to explore the importance of different plant features on plant choice. And we want to understand perceptions to the monetary values of these different plants and features. And then look to see, because we know not all consumers are the same. So what do the consumer segments look like when it comes to plant choice? And is there a role of consumer knowledge or product involvement? Does that factor in at all, into their role? So if a consumer is more knowledgeable about plants in general, do they have different behaviors than someone that's less knowledgeable about plants? Especially with the trends of more and more people, becoming gardeners with more time at home. So how we carried out the study is we had almost an equal number of participants from Canada and the US, so about 300 Canadian consumers and about 378 from the US. They were all 18 years and older, and they had purchased one or more plants in the past 12 months to qualify for the study. The study was completed over the summer online, as they said, and it took about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. And so what we were doing is we used something called a discrete choice experiment, where we identified different features that would be important for the plant type, and we gave them scenarios and then asked their interest around sort of purchasing of that plant to gain a perspective on what are the features that are encouraging them to purchase a plant and what are the features that are maybe taking away from purchasing, and then how does price play into that. So in terms of our plant categories, since we had the opportunity to have a broad reach of consumers in both Canada and the US, we wanted to get as much information as possible around plant categories. So we decided to focus on one plant that was a perennial. So we picked a daylily, one plant that was an annual, we picked a geranium, and one that was a shrub or tree, and we picked hydrangea. And this was in consultation with growers within the Canadian industry to get a sense of what categories would make sense. Then for each of these plant features, I know this slide's a bit busy, but I just want to show you the different things that we looked at. We looked at for each plant type, these different types of features. So things like flower size, and then they got them to see 3 different flower size, like small, medium, and large, or bloom time, if it blooms in the spring, fall, or summer. So we could use these different feature levels to create these different buying scenarios to gauge interest for these different plant types. And then we also divided it into hedonic features, which are really like the features associated with the appearance of the plant, versus the utilitarian features, which are features related more to the growth and maintenance of the plant in terms of dividing it. So for each plant category, we picked features that were specific to that plant to get more information. So for daylily, we had things like flower size, foliage habit, bloom time, hardiness, pot size. And for geranium, we had things like flower shape, where it's planted, type of container, if it attracts pollinators, growth rate, light requirements. And for hydrangea, we had things such as the plant type, the plant size, pruning requirements, bloom period, and then again, pot size for all of them. And then you'll see for each of the pot sizes, we had 3 different pot sizes and 3 different price points at each of those pot sizes. So to dive right into the results then, so, first, what I'll show you is what was their attribute rank across all the plant features, by plant type. So this is looking at sort of all the consumers like as a whole in both Canada and the US. And what we saw was that for daylily, what they would rank is in terms of, sort of maintenance, being kind of the top feature, followed by hardiness, number of blossoms, and then bloom time. For geranium, we see pot size being at the top of the list, pollinator by like pollinator attractors. So whether it attracts butterflies or hummingbirds, the light requirements of the plants, the growth rate, and followed by the display method. And then for hydrangea, we found bloom period, flower color, plant size, and pruning requirements to be sort of the key attributes that they would, in order of rank for each of those different plant types. So then what we did was we looked in at, okay, that's great. These are the attributes in general, but are there specific things about these attributes that drive preference and willingness to pay for these different plant categories? So that's what I'll summarize for you next for both Canada and US consumers for each of these different plant types. So if we look at daylily first, what we'll see is that both in Canada and the US, they liked large flowers that were displayed as buds and blooms, but in the US, they could also be displayed as full blooms and have equal sort of, preference and willingness to pay for these varieties. Winter hardiness was more important in Canada, and so looking for winter hardy plants that are low maintenance, whereas in the US, low to medium maintenance plants had higher preference and willingness to pay than high maintenance plants. Spring, summer bloom times for Canadian consumers versus no preference of bloom time for US consumers. And Canadian consumers were more price sensitive for 1 and 2 gallon pot sizes. So for the smaller pot sizes, they paid attention to the price more than the bigger pot size. Whereas in the US, the price sensitivity was just with the 1 gallon pot size. So as the pot size got bigger, they were less price sensitive, less likely to have price be part of their decision making in purchasing plants, or daylily specifically. So if we look at geranium, both sets of consumers, preferred when they were in pot displays versus ground displays. They both like messaging around attracting butterflies and hummingbirds, but just messaging around attracting butterflies was equally important in the US. They both like full sun and prefer that over full shade, but in the US, it can also be full sun to part shade and not influence, preference or willingness to pay. In Canada, looking for a moderate growth rate, whereas in the US, a fast to moderate growth rate of the plant. And both of them are more price sensitive to pot sizes greater than 4 inches. So at the smaller pot size, they're not really paying attention. And as the pot size goes up, they're paying attention to price more and willing to pay less. And so now for hydrangea. So both prefer the shrub type over the trees. They both like messaging around bloom color changes due to pH in the season and how that impacts bloom color. Both Canadian and US consumers are looking for low to medium pruning requirements and medium to long blooming season. So very similar in terms of their characteristics for hydrangea that they're interested in and they value. Where differences came in was around pricing. So price sensitivity to small pot formats of Canadian consumers, whereas US consumers, they were price sensitive to the 5-gallon pot size. So there are some sort of differences there. That could be important in terms of, how you position your inventory in a store. So as I mentioned, we also wanted to understand, so that's great. These are the features that they look at, but can we segment consumers in each of these regions to understand what is the size of the market? Is it, equal in terms of what consumers are looking like? And is there any role in consumer involvement or consumer knowledge that impacts their purchasing decision? So there's a lot of information sort of on these slides, but I'll just kind of sort of walk you through sort of what we're looking at here. But essentially for Canada, we had 3 segments, 46%, 32%, and 21%, whereas in the United States, we had the same number of segments, but segment 1 and 2, that should have a 2 there, are about the same size, and then segments 3 being smaller. So you can see that there's sort of similarities in sort of the attributes that are important, but the rank of importance of them is what changes between the different consumer groups. And then we also have sort of the demographic profile. So, the breakdown that you can see that defines that segment. And you will see that, there's some differences based on gender, based on age, but most people are married, have, like college, university. And then there are some differences based on income that you would see here throughout those profiles. In terms of consumer involvement, we're seeing sort of some differences in terms of the segments, with segment 1 and segment 2 in Canada showing high consumer involvement, segment 3 showing low. And similarly in the United States with the moderate versus sort of an equal proportion of of involvement that you would see. So there's sort of good information here about kind of defining your target market and who you're trying to sort of market it to. And so this is sort of good sort of follow-up information that you can go through and sort of look at to sort of better understand what consumers are seeking. So the same thing for geranium. So we've got the feature rank and same type of thing. So you can see in Canada, there's 3 different groups, but group 1 is definitely the biggest at 62%. Similarly, in the United States, there's one bigger group at 51%. For the Canadian consumer, it's, pollinator attractor, light requirement, display format, and, sort of flower shape that are sort of the key things, attributes that are important. And again, they difference in priority order across the different segments. And you can see that display format, growth rate, and light requirement come up in all the American segments, with pollinator attraction really just showing up in the smallest segment there. So maybe some differences, like more differences here that we see in terms of the consumer segments between the US consumers and the Canadian consumers. Again, in terms of a breakdown of their demographic profile, we see some differences in gender, age. Again, still most people, married, at least in all of the Canadian ones, slightly different levels of education that we see, and some different income ranges, across those different groups. So again, it's really about which group are you zeroing in on, and then sort of being able to look at the demographic profile for that group. And then again, seeing some differences of slight differences in terms of consumer involvement and consumer knowledge within these segments. Then for hydrangea, similar thing, except for some reason, I apologize, I forgot to put the segment numbers in, so I will add that in. See these things you see live? I will add those in so that they'll be there for the final piece of it. But here we see flower color, bloom period, plant size, and pruning requirements being key things, that consumers are looking for across the two groups. Again, some differences in terms of the demographic breakdown across those different consumer groups, but not too many differences here in terms of consumer knowledge or involvement that really separates out the groups. So when we look at sort of a comparison, then we do see that in general, they are quite similar in terms of their preference for plant features, and they're purchasing plants for sort of immediate decoration. They generally like larger plant sizes, moderate growth rates, and longer bloom periods for low to medium maintenance plants. And there's sort of key marketing messages, like you could see in the geranium, such as like attracting pollinators. That could be things that create excitement and interest around it. Looking for full sunlight requirements, and they prefer colorful varieties, seems to be what's coming out. In terms of Canadian consumers, we saw in particular that there was a bit more importance on hardiness tolerance, bloom time, and foliage habit than when compared to US consumers. And we found that consumers in both countries don't have any specific preference for elements such as like flower shape. That wasn't as important to them as some of the other features that were evaluated. So overall, we found that the role of knowledge and involvement didn't really have a significant impact. Sure, there were some differences based on the demographic profiles, and I've got some trends here of specific things that we found for sort of some consumers for a specific plant type. But overall, when we look at it, we can't kind of define how consumers are going to behave based on how involved or how knowledgeable they are around a plant category. So, we did see that, consumers with greater knowledge prefer higher maintenance daylilies. So maybe they see that as more of a challenge. Consumers with greater involvement are equally likely to prefer geraniums that attract butterflies, as well as butterflies and hummingbirds. Maybe they want something coming sort of into their gardens, so they're not as particular about what it is. And we saw that Canadian consumers with greater knowledge and involvement prefer hydrangeas with higher pruning requirements and shorter bloom periods. So again, maybe going to having more diversity in their gardens, more challenge in terms of, being able to get those plants sort of thriving in their landscape. So if we kind of look at the key takeaways from this, and you will see that, in the full report, there is some more detailed information that you can go and look at for it. I just needed to sort of condense it and summarize sort of the key things for this presentation. But you'll see sort of some of the key takeaways that we saw in terms of willingness to pay. They're willing to pay more for sort of the more utilitarian plant features, and Canadian consumers looking to pay more for things like tolerance or specific bloom periods, maybe because of more challenging growing conditions due to weather. In all other aspects, though, really Canadian US consumers were fairly similar in their preference for plant features. In terms of the role of consumer knowledge, we found that more knowledgeable consumers generally buy outdoor plants for immediate decoration and are looking for specific aesthetic features, like things like pollinators or a specific color or, number of blooms, those types of things. And they're more, the more knowledgeable they are, the more they're willing to seek challenges in terms of how those plants grow or ability to get those plants to grow. And as I mentioned, that the role of consumer involvement is generally limited. But we did see sort of some trends in terms of things like light and pruning requirements do have an impact on consumer preference, as well as things such as, the flower color being more important to consumer involvement. And there's the joys of working from home, right? There's my dog barking, so we must have a delivery. So essentially what it means is there's no one size fits all. There's no like one answer I can tell you about what's going for, but it's a lot of different information, that we're providing here around what are consumers looking for. And so really it's about like teasing through this to identify and create target messages based on the combination of factors that you value most for your consumer segments. So the next thing we did was we looked at this in-store versus online experience. And I apologize for my dog barking. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand, has shopping during COVID-19 impacted their plant purchase behavior, and explore factors related to in-store shopping and online shopping that consumers enjoyed or things that could be improved on. So we did this through some qualitative interviews. So we did 17 interviews in August of 2021 in 3 locations in Southern Ontario and Canada. Again, they were intercepted at the cash register as they were waiting to pay. So we knew they were going to purchase something that day. And so the first question we asked is, has the pandemic impacted your plant purchase habits? And if yes, how? And so we found that about 50% said there was no difference in plant purchasing. And less than 20% noticed they were purchasing fewer plants. Majority said they were purchasing more plants in bulk than they had before and have more time and money to spend on gardening than they had before. And that they prefer the in-store experience to curbside pickup or online. But I have to put that kind of caveat that I have below here, is these were all people that were intercepted at garden centers. So they've already made that choice before. They're already kind of, it's slightly biased towards them. We asked them, what are the aspects of in-store shopping experience do you care about the most? We kind of can break it up into these 4 buckets. So first, around plants, it was that 94% stated being able to see the plants is the most important. So being able to see them live, interact with them, and pick the one that they wanted. In terms of the garden center, 94% stated that customer service, staff help, and advice were the most important, especially when they were looking for something that they hadn't purchased before or interested in a new plant type. The shopping process was a big one, with 77% saying customer service and staff support being a key reason why they go in store, as well as, having guarantees, warranties, and like easy returns. And 65% said they'd like being able to walk around and compare the plants, to make their decision on what they want to purchase, sort of based on those features. Some challenges were restrictions and less staff on site made it more difficult to sometimes get the advice they were looking for, and that limits in sort of supply chain and finding limited inventory at the store was something that they found difficult. When we looked at some garden center attributes and asked them about things that they're looking for, important to them about a garden center, the top things were like plant varieties offered, personalized advice from garden center employees, deals, offers, and promotions, then followed by like having additional services like landscaping and those types of things. One thing that we saw, if you, and I'm sure this audience does, sort of being in the sector, but we do see that a lot of, garden centers are offering more like incentives to get people in, activities, all of these types of things. This was not something that was really picked up on by this group, but I think is something that, is a future trend and something that we would see shift if we were to then ask this question again in a year or two. We look at the online shopping experience and we ask which aspects of it did they care most about. Again, looking at sort of these similar buckets, plants. So basically 88% said that they liked it better when there was actual pictures of the plants versus stock pictures. So plants that like what the plants actually look like in your store with descriptions and care instructions. So those were things they really liked if an online website did provide to them versus it just being a stock description and not as much information about it. About the website, they liked like the convenience of it, that easy product searches, especially if they knew the plant names that they were looking for. And then again, that there wasn't as much travel required. And then the shopping process, the convenience of being able to do it from home, 24/7 access. And then also, so things around like, if they had easy returns or product exchanges, especially if what they got wasn't what they were expecting from this online shopping experience. So 71% said as a challenge is not being able to see or inspect the plants. Because remember, the vitality of the plant was a major consideration of consumers in terms of making that decision to purchase. And so being able to show, as straightforward as possible what the plant actually looks like, what its size, dimensions, colors are, is something that consumers found difficult. And then especially when all they were seeing were sort of stock images of those plants. So in terms of, kind of summarizing this all up and, providing some recommendations of how this could be applied to your business, all of this are things I've talked about, but it's just sort of always nice to see it sort of all in one concise place. So if we think about in summary and we're thinking about the plant features that are important to consumers, what we found was consumers aren't price sensitive when purchasing plants at garden centers, but and we know that they're purchasing a plant for a specific purpose, and that way like impulse purchases for plants are low. Features consumer value most in plants depends on the category. So say if it's an annual versus a perennial, and also on that plant variety. So, you can make some great, decisions based on the information here, but there may be some, variation based on different sort of plant types or categories that you're looking at. We identified plant features that consumers are willing to pay more for by country and also by plant category. And we identified segments that you can get a sense of who those consumers might be, to be able to sort of have some, directed, sort of marketing towards them. And information that you can use to create like targeted messaging towards, consumers based on a combination of features that they would value most. In terms of the shopping experience, we saw that, there's a lot of value in being able to interact, see, and determine plant quality on its own, and that there's just as much value in the staff and the customer service that's provided through the shopping experience, whether that be in an online or an in-person format. Deals, promotions, special offers are things consumers sort of always like, and that sort of drive them to your location. And that, things that could be improved are sort of nothing new, but is, just around inventory and being able to find their specific plants for a specific purpose. In terms of online shopping, it's the ease of navigating a website, seeing real pictures, having convenience with curbside pickup, and being able to shop 24/7, and being able to have, sort of guarantees and easy returns. And then, could be improved is having better photos and better way of them being able to search for the plants if they don't know the name of the plant or exactly what they're looking for. So how can you apply some of this stuff to your business? So, these are just sort of some ideas, and thoughts that, sort of come out of the research. But one is around sort of that price valuation. So we found that consumers are not price sensitive and are willing to pay more for features they value. So consider organizing your store based on these features that the consumers desire. So, perhaps if you're in a colder climate and that hardiness zones are something that's important to consumers in your area, maybe instead of talking about hardiness zones, which is very industry specific, and knowing if you're in zone 4A or 7, is talk about temperature ranges that they'll survive in, because that's a more consumer friendly way of getting consumers to understand that value of that feature of the plant. Or creating signage and having a whole section that these are all plants that are low maintenance and low care, so that they know any of those plants are going to meet those values that are going to be important to them, because they maybe don't have the skills, expertise, time, or ambition, to put a lot of time and effort into maintenance. You could even set up your store that you have an expert area for hard to grow plants, to give those consumers that love the challenge an area to sort of go in and sort of feature. So thinking about some of these types of things, of even just how you organize and create the flow, within your store, to sort of drive consumers to the things that they're looking for. So maybe highlight bloom periods. So these ones bloom in the spring, summer, fall, or different ideas like this that could work together. And then especially, if we know that, pot sizes, influence willingness to pay, color has, an influence on these things. So, organizing things maybe perhaps by color codes or by pot sizes. So consumers are going and finding exactly what they're looking for. And then not, again, looking at the price, but because they've found those issues that are sort of important for them. And then creating signage of things that would attract them as well. So we saw that, like attracting pollinators. And I know a lot of garden centers do some of these things already, but I'm saying these are all ways of then getting people to go in and see what they're looking for and grab it and sort of, and get what they need. In terms of impulse buying, so we did find impulse buying was low, but it doesn't mean they won't pick up items. And so maybe we need to think outside of the plant box in terms of impulse buying. So instead of, having all having all the gloves and tools and, plant food and supplies at the front of the store and all the plants at the back of the store, having them together. So their impulse purchase maybe isn't the plant because they don't have a space for it, but it's the care items that are needed to make that plant successful. So does your plant need pruning? Well, why not have pruners around that section so they can grab their plant and their pruners at the same time as they're kind of walking out of the store. Same thing if it needs specific nutrients, that could be something. I've heard this, very much on the food side of things, it's all about convenience, right? So why don't we make, everybody's making their meal kits and their food prep kits. Why don't we make plant kits for them? So they come in and they get their plant and everything they need to make that plant successful in their garden, all in one little box to sort of increase, what it is that they're going to purchase on site. And container size matters, but it's not one size fits all, right? And it's not one plant type fits all. But you can use this to figure out, how to manage your inventory, how you want to be pricing your plants. So maybe what you want to be doing is not thinking about, pricing plants linearly in terms of pot size, but instead thinking of, if consumers are willing to pay more for this plant size, we'll have more of those plants in that and less in the formats where they're not willing to pay as much, and then adjust your pricing and margins accordingly. As well, it might be an inventory management. So if they're less or they're more price sensitive to a certain pot format, well, maybe you don't offer in that pot format. And then that way, you're offering them something in where they're sort of seeking value and not really paying attention to the price, which then again helps, with profitability. And creating an inviting culture. So the consumers that are coming into garden centers, we found, are niche consumers. They're coming to garden centers for a particular reason. They're choosing not to shop other places. And that's probably part of the reason too, why they're not sort of paying attention to the price. So whether it's in-store, online, curbside, your garden center staff and the culture that you're providing is a huge asset. And consumers value and are coming for the knowledge that center is providing. So, invest in training and education and, sort of staff motivation to stay engaged with the consumers coming through, to keep those consumers coming in to shop at your place and making decisions and purchasing plants and not really paying attention, as much to the price, because they're getting all the other features they value out of that experience. So with that, I'm at my time. I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I will stop there and I will hand it back to Karen and stop sharing my screen for now, and happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for all of your work on the study and for the great presentation. As we wait for some more questions to come in, I have a few just to get us started. I know that a lot of the results center around the willingness to pay. How do you define willingness to pay, and what type of premium could be added to a product to increase that?
Yeah, so in terms of what we looked at is willingness to pay, was we based it on prices of like that pot, the pot size for that specific plant. And then understanding, if at a certain pot size and at a certain price, did that increase or decrease, their sort of interest in making a plant decision, and did that have a factor that overweighed the other sort of plant features that we were looking at. But one of the things that we did do based on in this study, based on our sort of initial work, where we saw that price didn't have, that consumers weren't really price sensitive, is that we set our prices higher than what they would sort of normally be, at a store. So we took what like the average price would be for a pot size, and then we increased it by 20% to see, if at 20% higher, they would still, be willing to purchase that, or at what level they would pay attention to price. And we saw that for some plant types and some pot sizes, it sort of didn't make a difference. It sort of came into that value. In terms of how you apply that to your garden center, I think you have to look at what your, consumers are, used to paying, and how you can sort of build that value up. So, if your pot size is normally, $2.99 and everything, and the next year they come in and everything's at $7.99, well, they're probably going to notice that, and that's sort of not that price sensitivity. But it's figuring out where you want to sort of position it and what margins you want to be able to sort of try to apply sort of to it, and focusing on that. It seems like in perennials, smaller pot sizes, consumers aren't really paying attention to sort of the price, but when it's a perennial, it gets into a larger pot size, then they do pay attention to the price. So if you want to increase your pricing, you want to be doing it on those sort of smaller pot sizes than on those sort of larger pot size formats. So there's not like a clear sort of easy answer to it, and it's quite complicated. And I think another thing too, in terms of willingness to pay, to think about it is there's a lot more research you could do around, defining, sort of what those limits are, and when consumers sort of will pay attention to it. And remembering these are also garden center consumers.
So noting that we did focus on garden centers, do you think that you would find similar results with consumers for shopping at big box or grocery garden centers?
I think there would be differences. And I think this is based on kind of when we look at the average consumer and then where they're going to shop. So I think, if if people are going to discount stores, they might be going because they're valuing other things in that plant purchasing decision. So it could be that, the reason they're going to a big box store is because they just need red color for the front of their house and they don't really care what it looks like, and they're going for the best price, versus someone that's going to a garden center because they want, they've got sort of more investment, more sort of interest, more knowledge. So I do think that the price sensitivity would be different based on sort of what your location is. And that was actually, I will be honest, that was something we did want to look at. And I think something that would be very interesting to look at is that comparison. But COVID restrictions prevented us from being able to do that, like in this study. So I do think that some of the trends would probably be the same, but I think the pricing model, the pricing information would probably be different.
Great, thank you. What do you think, from your perspective, was the biggest insight or most exciting result from this study?
I have to say, there was lots of them. It was a very interesting, project to work on. I think, from the initial, which I think I sort of said within it, we were really surprised about the pricing. That I didn't really seem to sort of notice the pricing. But then you think about the plant categories and you think about, why people are sort of going into a garden center and sort of what they're looking for. Maybe it isn't surprising that they're going in because they're plant lovers and they're sort of true hobbyists and sort of they're building on it. But I think that was sort of one of the very kind of exciting findings from it. And also this impulse purchase thing, because I don't know, this is putting my own bias on it. I know I'm not supposed to do that, but I'm definitely an impulse purchaser when I go buying plants. I always come home with way more than I need and go, now where am I going to fit this? So I think that was sort of something that surprised me, that people go in with such a defined kind of vision of what they're looking at and are kind of like sort of more controlled shoppers. And I think that provides an opportunity of targeting, targeting, I guess, the message and provide sort of opportunities of engaging with consumers and what they're looking for. And also thinking about the, when they're looking for a size and dimension, are they looking for it now or are they looking for it in 5 years, right? Because I think that's another thing that we didn't really investigate, is that we saw that where they want to put the plant is so important to what the consumer is trying to is what the consumer's ultimate choice is. But do they want it ready-made so it's going to go in there and it's going to stay that size forever, or are they looking for something to grow and fill the space? So I think that's something that would be of interest as well to understand.
I think that feeds into this comment that we received from one of our attendees. It says, it seems counterintuitive that knowledgeable consumers would buy plants for immediate satisfaction. I would have thought that they would have known the potential of a plant instead of immediate satisfaction. And so there was some results that you had that spoke a little to that. Do you think that's a trend?
Yeah, I think what we found is that, we had sort of anticipated that knowledge, or how involved they are, like how many hours they spend gardening, would really kind of separate out and define certain consumers and what they value in the products. And we didn't see that so much as an overall. We saw specific sort of elements on that with specific plant features. So we did see that more experienced and knowledgeable consumers, for the plant categories liked, higher maintenance daylilies or higher pruning requirement plants. And I think that goes to that it does, that those are the consumers that are going for that long-term gain or looking for shorter bloom periods. But what we saw is that it was a smaller group of the consumers than we were expecting it to be. And that the amount of knowledge they had about gardening and the amount of time or involvement they spent doing it didn't have as much influence on the characteristics that they valued the most as we thought they would. So yeah, so some of it does seem a bit counterintuitive, but if you sort of look in specifically at specific elements, you will see that, for that consumers, there's always going to be exceptions. So yes, it does follow the path sometimes, that with high knowledge, they're looking for that long-term gain. They're looking for sort of the plants, and we really saw that too, I would say, in the hydrangea and daylily, which makes sense, versus the geranium. So in an annual, it especially doesn't make much of a difference because they know they're buying that plant every year.
I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question, and then unless we have any other questions come through in the chat or the Q&A, I will close, but there is still time if you would like to submit an additional question or two, go ahead and put it in the chat or the Q&A. You've talked a little bit about this and kind of looking forward on potential other research that could be done. What future research do you think could be done based on these findings that you would like to see moving forward?
Yeah, I think a key thing that we could do moving forward for this is really, is really kind of figuring out that price valuation piece of it. So doing something like flower, doing something like an auction or something like that, where people come in and see the same plant in different pot sizes and different features and what they're actually willing to pay for it, because they'll like sort of put their money down on it, or something that we could do in, in a garden center along that way. So I think there's always more information that we can do around kind of, sort of how we sort of value that. But I think another thing too is around how to, now that we know features that are important, how can you use that information to create value, in your store, in your advertising sort of with consumers. So I think more could be done in terms of following up on some of the key findings, the key trends, the key insights from this, to dive in a little deeper to see how it translates, from daylily into other perennials. Are the trends really similar, or do the trends really vary by plant type? And is this really just specific to this plant type? Or if we were to then, look at roses or look at another, perennial plant, would we see, a similar trend or something very different? So I think that would be really interesting and useful as well. Because right now we're making, inferences that, we can translate this across a category, but it may be very much plant specific. So I think that's a key place to look as well.
Great. We had someone ask if they have the links to the full survey results, and I just want to verbally answer that. So the full report is available online. The link has been put into the chat. We will also have the webinar recording available on that same page too once we process it later today. So you'll have access to both the recording and the full report. And then in follow-up, we at FMF will do a couple of breakdown articles just going into a little bit more detail of the data. So go ahead and take a look at that on our site. Since I do not see any additionals come in, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. You're getting a couple of thank yous for the data, Amy. I want to thank Amy at Vineland Research Center and the University of Guelph. We look forward to future opportunities for collaboration. If anyone would like to ask any additional questions or get more involved with the Floral Marketing Fund, please reach out to us at info@floralmarketingfund.org. That will be placed in the chat for you. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. If you could, please take a moment to fill out our follow-up survey once the webinar closes, and let us know if you have any requests for future consumer research and marketing topics. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.